afternoon, everyone. I'm Jason Marzak, Director of the Adrian Arsht Latin America Center. Ambassador Chapman, Ambassador Forrester, so important that you're joining us today at this pivotal moment for U.S.-Brazil relations. I'm also very pleased to welcome Adrian Arsht, who all of you know is the founder of the Adrian Arsht Latin America Center, as well as the founder of the Adrian Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center, Executive Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council, and also, real importantly for today's discussion, has a long and deep relationship with Brazil. Adrian is an incredibly accomplished businesswoman and philanthropist, and she will introduce the two ambassadors after the General's remarks. Before launching into today's discussion, I think it's also very important to take a moment to say that the last week here in the United States has brought to the forefront long-standing problems in our country and the need for us to collectively work to address the inequalities in our society. I've been thinking a lot these days of the words of Martin Luther King Jr., one of which he said, the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. For the Adrian Arsht Latin America Center, this is a moment to double down on our mission and to continue across the hemisphere to advance policies that will promote socioeconomic prosperity for all. Today's conversation, which also comes amid the coronavirus pandemic and new travel restrictions for those coming from Brazil, will also be an important opportunity to hear from both ambassadors on how the US and Brazil can deepen trade and investment. This event also marks the start of the next phase of a multi-year effort for us to explore, along with Apex Brazil, the AmCham, and other partners, how the US and Brazil can expand commercial relations for mutual benefit, with the perspective that our relations must go beyond any one moment in time and beyond any one administration in time. This work was born from mutual understanding by both countries of the importance of seizing on commercial opportunities that have the potential to open new doors for economic growth. Our discussion today will be moderated by the Center's Associate Director and the Brazil lead in the Center, Roberta Braga. But first, I want to turn the virtual floor over to General Garçon Menandro from Apex Brazil, our partner in this important and ongoing work. General will give a few moments of comments, and then he will hand the program over to Adrian Arsht. So with that, General, the floor is over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first of a sequence of 4 webinars that begins today, dedicated to the discussion of the US-Brazil trade and investment relations. It's an honor to make this virtual introductory remarks and represent the Brazilian Trade and Investment Promotion Agency, Apex Brazil. I'd like to especially thank Jason Marzak and Roberta Braga, directors of the Adrian Arsht Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council, and also greet Ms. Deborah Vieiras, AmCham CEO in Brazil, an outstanding partner of us. We are truly honored with your presence today. I also greet all the participants. Thank you for your presence and time. We know how limited this precious resource called time is. Very briefly, Apex Brazil is a non-profit agency linked to the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Apex Brazil represents 14,000 Brazilian companies which are responsible for 30% of Brazilian exports. We work hard to gather relevant players, putting government and the private initiative at the same table in a movement to promote Brazilian business abroad and to attract foreign direct investment, FDIs. We are glad that our work has helped Brazil to be the 4th global FDI destination last year. According to the Central Bank of Brazil, our economy received $78 billion of foreign direct investments in 2019. This number shows investors' confidence in the long term because Brazil is a country of millions of people and opportunities. It has been exactly 3 months that we launched the English version of the report, so-called US-Brazil Trade and FDI Report, Enhancing the Bilateral Economic Relationship. Report written by Brazilian and American trade and investment specialists outlined concrete short and long-term actions for the economic synergies between the two largest economies in the Americas, with a focus on concluding a free trade agreement as a final step. As we all know, the recent scenario has changed. The world economy had a severe impact. The pandemic brought huge challenges in terms of rethinking trade and investment strategies. Thus, we take the chance today not only to launch the Portuguese version of the report, but also gather highly qualified and insightful opinions about the way ahead. At Apex, we've been doing our homework to mitigate the impacts on Brazilian business. Indeed, we have 23 new work fronts dealing with trade and investment issues related to the COVID-19, which includes a hot site, webinars like this today, podcasts, a business plan for exporters in times of the pandemic, and a handful of useful dashboards. Among the dashboards, I call your attention to the one dedicated to the Brazilian exports to the US, disaggregated by state level. I do invite you to navigate and explore this tool. The link will be available at the end of the presentation. We are confident that with the political will and the support of the private sector, Brazil and US, the Western Hemisphere, large economies and democracies have a unique opportunity to explore new ways to deepen their bilateral trade and investment relationship. Today, we all have the privilege to learn directly from our distinguished guests, Ambassador Nestor Forster from Brazilian Embassy in Washington, D.C., and Ambassador Todd Chapman from U.S. Embassy in Brasilia, Brazil. Please welcome our speakers. We look forward to listening and learning the latest developments on the U.S.-Brazil economic relationship. Now I'll give the floor to Ms. Adrienne Arsht, Executive Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much.
And thank you, General and Apex, for your partnership and support. I went to Brazil for my first time in January 1964, and I went to Brasilia, where Ambassador Chapman is now located. It was a brand new city and very exciting. Ambassador Chapman has been there in the embassy since March 29, arrived at a very significant point in history and all of our lives. Prior to that, he was ambassador to Ecuador. He is a career Foreign Service diplomat and brings a great deal of experience and knowledge to his current post. Ambassador Forster is actually living more or less across the street from me. The Brazilian embassy is literally across the street. And so as soon as we can, with social distancing, we'll walk back and forth and greet each other. Ambassador Forster has a very, very significant career in diplomacy for his country. He actually served at the embassy here in several occasions. And not long ago, I had the special honor to have been awarded the Brazilian Order of the Rio Branco, which was presented to me by Ambassador Forster. I think the uniqueness of having these two ambassadors brought together so closely at this time is very fortunate for all of us to hear their points of view today and juxtaposed to each other on the screen. And with that, I turn this over to the Associate Director and our Brazil lead, Roberta Braga.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Thank you, Jason, General Menandro. I am so happy to be here today moderating this conversation with both ambassadors. This is, as was mentioned, the beginning of really a second leg in our work on US-Brazil trade and FDI. We've been looking at this topic now for a couple of years in partnership with Apex and AmCham, and so I couldn't be happier to be kicking off this conversation in such a unique moment. So much has changed since we began looking at this topic, and really it's advancing a relationship that the two countries share for so long. So I'd like to kick off the conversation with the question to both of you, Ambassadors Forster and Chapman. As I mentioned, the US and Brazil, we all know this very well, have been hit very hard by the pandemic, were the countries most impacted by it. And you both kind of began your presence in your respective diplomatic roles more or less just as this was developing. And so I wanted to ask you, sort of on a personal note and also as ambassadors, what were your priorities coming in, and how has this pandemic affected how you approach those priorities? How has the current context in which we're living impacted your roles as ambassadors of your respective countries? And I'll start with you, Ambassador Chapman.
Well, thank you very much, Roberta, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting us for this event. It's a pleasure to be speaking with the Atlantic Council once again, as I've done in the past. A special privilege to be with Adrian. Thank you for all your leadership, and for Jason and just the whole group. It's a pleasure to be with you, and it's always a pleasure to be with my friend and colleague, Ambassador Forster. Of course, when anticipating arriving in Brazil, back when I was doing my hearing, etc., we had a very expansive dialogue and expansive agenda to pursue, from economic to education to health to economic. I mean, we have a very broad and deep relationship. But of course, with the advent of COVID-19, as I've said here publicly, working now in the health situation is my first, second, and third priority. To attend to the 1,500 staff at the U.S. mission, to work with the 275,000 resident Americans here that also we serve. And then, of course, being a good friend and partner with the government and people of Brazil as they address this pandemic. And so it certainly has had an impact. I'm speaking to you from my office in my home. I'm not at the embassy, and we're at 95% teleworking. But that hasn't slowed up our work. We continue to work on a broad range of topics and issues that we'll get into later. But right now, we're focused very much on being the best possible partner with Brazil as we share this very difficult experience of how to address the pandemic and the loss of life.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador Forster, I do want to pose the same question to you, and I'll tag on to that question as well. The question of whether you think that there are opportunities for bilateral cooperation that you didn't envision pre-coronavirus, but that today are especially relevant.
Thank you, Roberta. Let me start by thanking the Atlantic Council, Adrian Arst, for her leadership in this, and also Apex and AmCham for organizing this very timely conversation. Also like to thank Ambassador Chapman for being here with us today. Let me start, you mentioned a personal note. I had the highly dubious honor of being a pioneer in getting the COVID back in March. And I had a very mild case. And our priority, from the get-go, was to make sure that our team at the embassy was safe. And I'm happy to report that we have not had another case. With all the people that work at our embassy, we took several measures to make that possible, including teleworking. Since then, it was right after the historic meeting, the historic dinner of both our presidents in Mar-a-Lago, that the pandemic really took off here in the US and then in Brazil. And we had this big challenge of keeping the tremendous energy, the tremendous vision that was coming from our heads of state since Mar-a-Lago, to keep that momentum, to keep that agenda going. And I think we've done exactly that. You asked me about specifically what we are doing that we would not have done without a pandemic. And I think first and foremost, we have a tremendous ongoing cooperation between our countries at all levels. And there's a great work being done by Ambassador Chapman and the whole team at the embassy there in Brasilia in terms of, having an ongoing dialogue for research, for vaccine, for testing, for new therapies to deal with this terrible disease. There have been, donations from the American government, which have been highly appreciated by the Brazilian people, in forms of ventilators, medicines, etc. So, this is one more area where our friendship and, our renewed alliance shows itself.
Thank you, sir. Ambassador Chapman, I wanted to pivot from that, talking a little bit as well, not only about what new opportunities have evolved from the pandemic, but what you also see as biggest opportunities for deepening the bilateral economic relations nowadays in this context. And I would add to that as well for you, we know that both Presidents Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro had an initial reaction to COVID-19, wherein they compared it to something more mild, a colder flu. And so my question is as well, what has each government learned since then? How has their approach evolved? And then what lessons do you think that the United States can provide Brazil, and vice versa, Brazil can provide the United States on this?
Yeah, well, first of all, Roberta, I would point out the fact that the partnership between Brazil and US on health matters is truly longstanding. We have had an office of the CDC within the Ministry of Health since 2011. And we have here resident, a health attaché, Dr. Amy Dubois, an epidemiologist, and we have a wide array of assistance and, more important, opportunities to exchange scientific and medical information with one another that is very active, very vibrant, and that has only increased during this pandemic period. So we have a lot to learn from each other. We have a lot of scientific information to share. We work with not only the Ministry of Health, and I was met with the minister earlier this week, but also with Theo Cruz, the very well-respected medical research operation here in Brazil. So really, we have a long-standing relationship on health, and it's only getting better and more profound. On the economic opportunities coming out of COVID-19, I would say it is really related to the deepening and broadening of the already significant relationship we have. We have huge relationships in manufacturing, the financial sector, agriculture. This relationship is broad and deep. And so the focus now of our governments is to try and create even an improving economic and business environment so that the established relationships can grow and we can imagine new areas of cooperation and economic opportunity, whether it's in financial tech, whether it's in digital trade, whether it's in figuring out new ways to have scientific research facilities in each other's countries to take advantage of the burgeoning relationship between a number of our universities. So there really are just a tremendous number of opportunities right now. And our job now as governments and as ambassadors is to do everything that we can to facilitate those dialogues. And I'm very pleased to report that even during this time that we're all addressing the pandemic, these economic discussions between our technical, trade, economic agencies are progressing at a very rapid clip.
Ambassador, I'd like to pick up on something you mentioned. You mentioned various industries in which Brazil and the United States cooperate very closely.
Yeah.
Ambassador Forster, kind of passing on to you, I did want to ask I know that all industries have been affected deeply by this, but for Brazil, from Brazil's perspective, which industries have been most impacted over the few months? And then how can closer ties with the United States from Brazil's perspective, especially in trade and investment, position Brazil to kind of get back out from under this difficult time period looking forward?
Absolutely, Renata. If I can backtrack just one point to refer to what was done on COVID in Brazil, there was some misinterpretations of the approach that was taken by the federal government. Like the United States, Brazil is a federative republic, so you have the three levels of government. And in Brazil, there has been a clear division between the role played by the federal government in providing the resources and setting some guidelines, and the guidelines being enforced and, let's say, microtuned by local governments, state governors and local administrations. President Bolsonaro, from the outset, has said basically two things about how to fight COVID. He said that in a country as large and as regionally diverse as Brazil, it's very hard to have a one-size-fits-all solution. So solutions should be adjusted at the local level, and that's proven right, as we have excellent results in some parts of Brazil that haven't taken apparently, the right measures to fight this. The other point is that this is a public health emergency, but it's not only a health issue. It has tremendous repercussions and impact for social questions, economic questions, and the view of the President Bolsonaro's government has been that we should tackle all these fronts at the same time. We cannot do only one in detriment and leave the others behind. Otherwise, the results might be very tough for our population. So we've been trying this integrated approach, which ended up being praised by international organizations. Now, in terms of the possibilities, I mean, the industries that were hit hardest in Brazil, like worldwide, travel, tourism, the durable goods industry haven't perhaps taken the hardest hit. It should be borne in mind that this is temporary. At the same time, Brazil is set to harvest the largest harvest in agricultural, in our agribusiness ever this year. So there's a tremendous growth in the agricultural sector, even during this terrible situation of the pandemic. It also should be noted Brazil has been the country least affected in terms of its foreign trade among the G20 countries, data that just came out last week. So we are showing some resilience in our trade performance abroad, which I think it's good news looking forward.
Thank you, sir. I have one last question for both of you, and then I would like to pivot over to what the next phase might be of the U.S.-Brazil trade and FDI relationship. My last question is, Ambassador Forster, as you've mentioned, the two countries have dealt with the crisis in unique ways in the context that makes the most sense for them, and working between the federal and local government. As both Brazil and the United States do this, how do you think their respective approaches impacted how investors perceive the two countries? And then as a follow-up question to that, we can't ignore that on last week, May 27th, the US began restricting entry of non-US citizens who had been previously in Brazil for 14 days from coming in. Ambassador Forster, for you in particular, how do you think that this measure and other measures of this type might impact investment, bilateral investment?
It's designed to be a public health measure, and we expect it will not have a great impact on bilateral trade and investment. Mind you that Brazil had taken the same measure back in March 27th. We established restrictions on all foreigners, not only on Americans, but all foreigners coming by plane to Brazil due to public health concerns, uniquely as it was the case here in the United States. There are exceptions. It's important that people who look at this know that, people who have relatives in the United States who are permanent residents here, green card holders, etc. There's a series of exceptions, as there are in Brazil in our restrictions, which, give some leeway for essential travel to continue. But those measures are temporary. They should go away as soon as the numbers start to improve, which we expect will be soon. In terms of opportunities, I like to quote what Minister Paulo Guedes has recently said, that the pandemic should not be an excuse to do less or to procrastinate, but to do more and to accelerate the process of economic reform in Brazil. And that's exactly what we intend to do. And we expect that by the end of this year, we'll be able to tackle the most important tax reform on top of the reforms we have undertaken last year, which have put Brazil perhaps in a better shape to face the dire economic situation, the challenges we have ahead. Second thing, a final point, is that we should be very clear about measures that are being taken momentarily, temporarily, to fight the disease and its economic effects, what some have called wartime measures, and the commitments of the Brazilian government to fiscal responsibility, sustainability going forward, and basically the commitment to accelerate and reform.
Thank you, sir. Before we do pivot over to U.S.-Brazil trade and FDI, Ambassador Chapman. Is there anything you'd like to add related to COVID-19 and the U.S.'s priorities in combating the pandemic?
I think we've covered that pretty well. We're going to continue with the assistance that we're providing to the Brazilians, both to the government and to the private sector through international organizations and Brazilian organizations here. And I just want to underscore something Ambassador Forster just mentioned. The Brazilian government here has been firmly intent on accelerating the economic reform measures. I read some of the international economic press that has taken a very bearish view on the ability of the government to pass its economic reform measures. I can only tell you what I have experienced here in Brasilia, and that is as I meet with the ministries, as I meet with the head of the Congress, I've been meeting with the leaders, including the president of the Congress, President Rodrigo Maia. There is even a firmer commitment to economic reform. And so we're working on that with them. We're having very good technical talks about so many different issues, whether it's on tax, whether it's on digital trade, whether it's on mining regulations, whatever it is, we're having extensive conversations with this government. And so I believe the international press largely has it incorrect based on my own experience interacting with the government leaders. And we're encouraging this. We believe that these economic reform measures are the ones that are going to allow this economic partnership with Brazil to grow even further as we come out of the COVID-19 crisis.
Thank you, sir. I do remind, before we pivot over to the economic theme, I want to remind our audiences that you can submit questions for the ambassadors in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Type it in about 10 minutes to close. We will take some questions from the public. So I do want to talk now about the next phase of the trade and FDI relationship. About 2 months ago, as we mentioned earlier, before the virus really hit, the Atlantic Council, along with you, Ambassador Forster, and representatives from both the United States and Brazil, we showcased the scope of the U.S.-Brazil trade and FDI ties in a comprehensive report that we launched with short-term and long-term recommendations. And we saw last night some members of the Committee on Ways and Means of the U.S. Congress sending a letter as well to U.S. Trade Representative Lighthizer, citing some concerns. Ambassador Forster, my question to you is both, could you tell us more about the progress the U.S. and Brazil are making in deepening the trade discussions and what they've done in the past few months? And then also as well, I did want to give you the opportunity to share your perspective on efforts that address environmental protections and that address labor standards, which were two themes that were raised in the letter as well.
Absolutely. Let me start by just mentioning, the tremendous progress, as Ambassador Chapman referred to. We are not sitting idly doing all this time. Much to the contrary, we've been extremely busy, and we've conducted, several meetings under the framework of the Agreement on Trade and Economic Cooperation, ATAC. We also had an edition of the Commercial Dialogue. We also have a preparatory meeting for the next CEO Forum, which will take place sometime in Brazil in the second semester. Those discussions have enabled us to make concrete progress towards achieving the vision that our president set at Mar-a-Lago, of having a meaningful trade and economic package by the end of this year. We have, made a lot of progress in what regards trade facilitation. That's one area where we are, very close to wrapping up conversations, I'd say. We have ongoing talks on good regulatory practices and e-commerce. Those talks are well advanced, and we expect to have something by the end of the year, which was the date set. On top of that, we have just begun discussions on anti-corruption measures, an anti-corruption package that we could agree on. We have just received the proposal from the US side, and we'll be taking a look at it and reacting to it in the coming days and weeks. We also have begun what we should call a dialogue on intellectual property issues. We have received some issues of interest for the American side, and we have agreed to take a look jointly look at those issues and have an ongoing dialogue, exchange information, which might be very helpful looking forward. We see all this, as stepping stones towards something more ambitious at the end for a more meaningful commercial agreement at certain point in the near future. I'd just like to highlight one point before addressing the question of the letter, that, if you look at the report issued by the Atlantic Council 2 months ago, and I understand you're releasing the Portuguese version today, right?
That's right.
Very welcome. If you look at the issues recommended by the Atlantic Council, APEX, MCHM, Chamber of Commerce, US Brazil Business Council, those who had inputs into that study, you see there's a tremendous convergence between the views of the private sector and the views of the two governments. And I think that's key and that's essential for us to be able to continue to move forward at the speed we are moving. This tremendous synergy that comes from having the private sector fully on board, and we paying attention to what you're telling us that are your areas of concern. As for the letter, that's part of the process. That some the congressman will express concerns about this or that issue. It's very helpful to us to engage in those discussions so we can clarify points, misinformation that might be around. Look, you mentioned the environment. Last year we had this big outcry about the Amazon being on fire. I spent a lot of time, and it's time well spent, quite frankly, on the Hill and with people in the US, different areas of the government, the administration, NGOs, etc., explaining and bringing facts, and dispelling myths. So, this administration, President Bolsonaro's administration, is as committed to environmental protection in Brazil as any other administration. What's different this time is that President Bolsonaro has expressed a big concern about the 25 million Brazilians who live in the Amazon region, who are among the poorest of Brazilians. So what we've been saying is that, we need to bring sustainable development to those people, both sides, the environmental conservation protection on one side, but also economic opportunity and growth for those people who need it badly.
Thank you, sir. Ambassador Chapman, and also to you, Ambassador Forster, we did mention this chapter-specific, multi-chapter trade enhancement agreement. And as we understand it, the two governments are currently in discussion about this. So my question is, to both of you, what will an agreement that addresses trade facilitation, digital trade, and good regulatory practice mean for the two countries? And then for those who might not be trade specialists or who might not be focusing on trade, what are the practical implications of an agreement like this one? Ambassador Chapman, I'll start with you.
Okay, good. Now, in my professional experience, whenever a country is talking about very detailed subjects, that's a very good sign. Because when a government is, the relationships are not as strong, you say,
oh, I think we've froze just for a second. Ambassador Chapman, can you hear us? Ambassador Forster, I might pass the question on to you then while we see if we can reconnect with Ambassador Chapman.
Let me see if I can try to follow up on the same track of mind that Ambassador Chapman was following, about getting specific and what this means. I mean, we talk about trade facilitation. It sounds kind of esoteric, good regulatory practice. These sorts of areas are fundamental in getting rid of red tape, of inefficiencies built into our systems, getting rid of red tape, streamlining the process of, the commercial operations, import, export between the two countries. This has to do with providing, a much desired transparency for the way foreign trade works on both sides. Having very practical things like, a one window for all export or import operations, with a very clear process on how to address concerns, grievances that the companies might have. So this is a direct and I say very important effect on trade. We know people tend to concentrate too much on tariffs. Sometimes when you talk about foreign trade, there's a study by UNCTAD that says that regulatory, the whole regulatory framework, if it's addressed properly, it can bring a reduction, which would be a tariff equivalent of anything between 12 and 20%. So you see that there's even a component of trade liberalization in that. Even though we're not discussing tariffs, we're discussing rules. And rules seem to be the future of international trade, much more than just the numeric quotas and tariffs barriers to the export of goods. So I think this is, it's unquestionably very meaningful for both our countries, and we expect very concrete results coming out of this. And as I said, we see this as stepping stones, as building blocks towards something bigger and more encompassing.
Thank you, sir. I think we did disconnect with the Ambassador Chapman just briefly. So actually, while he reconnects, I think this is a good opportunity to take some questions from the audience. We did just get some on this topic. So Ambassador Forster, the question we have from the audience is related somewhat, but also expands to the European Union. So the question was, how is Brazil navigating its relationship with the US, given the market access and regulatory commitments that Brazil made in the EU-Mercosur trade agreement? And are there any lessons learned or frameworks that are being adopted in this relationship, specifically when it comes to sensitive industries? So rules of origin, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, et cetera.
Yeah, excellent question. Excellent question. Look, we are not, Brazil and the United States are not engaged in in tariff concessions, market access negotiations, as we just wrapped up last year with the European Union. Just a parenthesis, we wrapped up those negotiations after 20 years. We don't expect our ongoing conversation with the United States to have to last that long. It's 2 decades might be too much. But so what we see is, on one point, there's a very interesting interplay between what we did with Europeans and what we want to do with the United States, and we are doing with other countries. We have ongoing talks with Canada, with South Korea. We're starting talks with Japan. So basically, Brazil wants to open up its economy. We see that as something in our own interest. I have a colleague who works at the Ministry of the Economy who likes to repeat that the most meaningful trade agreement for Brazil is not with the European Union, even though it's the largest in history. It's not with the United States, largest economy in the world. The most meaningful trade agreement for Brazil would be a free trade agreement with Brazil itself, reducing its costs, cutting red tape, eliminating inefficient bureaucracy, basically reducing the cost of doing business in Brazil. Which only brings inefficiencies, and sometimes it's not very helpful to help us attract foreign investment. In terms of the framework that we are using, of course, the agreement we have celebrated with Europeans is a very updated agreement. Let's say, it encompasses all the new sectors in terms of technology, intellectual property, sensitive issues. The sensitive issues tend to vary. They tend to be country specific, even region specific, when we engage in a free trade negotiation. So, that's something that it will be an interesting experience for us to learn from what we did with the Europeans. But it's not something that can be immediately applied to anything we're doing right now. But the framework in some areas, like the disciplines, the rules, I think there'll be a lot to do, because this is a state-of-the-art agreement as well.
Great, sir. We did have a second question, and I know that it's one that you and I have discussed, and we've discussed in depth in the group over the last year, but it was regarding a free trade agreement. And the question was, how achievable is a free trade agreement in 2020, which I think I know the answer to, but when could we expect an FTA to be signed between the US and Brazil?
Look, I don't have any crystal ball in that regard. There is the ultimate goal, and that's there are clear signals from both sides that is a goal that both our countries think is worth pursuing. In the medium term, how soon we'll be able to work with it, it's not clear. There are questions. There are legal requirements both on the U.S. side, less on Brazil side. We are more deregulated in that aspect, but there are things that need to be observed and rights that need to be followed, and I understand that they'll be taken care of when the time is appropriate. Now, I like to, instead of thinking, when can we have an FTA, I like, since my friend Ambassador Chapman is not here, I'll try to fill in for him and repeat something he recently said, which I liked very much. He said we should work with the goal of doubling the trade between Brazil and the U.S. Trade between Brazil is roughly $105 billion last year. There's tremendous potential to do much more than that. Mexico, of course, you have a free trade agreement. You do 6 times more trade with Mexico than you do with Brazil. and Brazil is a much larger economy. So there's tremendous room for growth there. And I would like to add one thing to what to Ambassador Chapman said. Is, I think this goal is ambitious, doubling trade in 5 years. It's an ambitious goal, but it's absolutely feasible. I think we should add to that, I don't know the time frame, but we also should look into doubling the investment, bilateral investment, both ways. If you look at the Brazilian investment in the United States, it has grown 350% in the past decade. It increased 3.5 times. So there's room for growth also in the investment side, and one reinforces the other and generates this very virtuous cycle, which is what we aim at with the reforms we are undertaking in Brazil.
Thank you, sir. I did just hear that Ambassador Chapman's internet had some issues, which I think we all know is a risk of this virtual new world. He's connecting by phone, so we should have him back shortly. But Ambassador Forster, I did want to then pivot to the third part of our conversation. I know we only have about 15 minutes left, which is priorities for the future. And I wanted to talk to you particularly about the OECD. Brazil's taken concrete steps to be compliant with OECD's standards. It continues to advance on adhering to various regulatory best practices in agriculture, in tax information sharing, protection of e-commerce. This year, the US formally backed Brazil for OECD membership. And so I wanted to ask you, where does Brazil stand right now in regard to the accession to the OECD?
We're ready to get in as soon as the door opens. That door is being kept shut for a while because of the whole political aspects of the organization. We have the full support of the United States government. We are highly appreciative of that, being the US, the largest member, largest economy in the OECD. We are waiting for European countries to show some way forward in terms of will we need an European country being announced as well or not? We hope we can solve this pretty fast. We look at this more at a substantive point of view. Why does Brazil want to join the OECD? And this is really a priority for us. Why? Because we see a tremendous synergy, a complementarity between what we want to do in terms of economic reform and the kinds of disciplines and levels of discipline that would be required from Brazil by joining the OECD. Roberta, as you know, Brazil has already joined 82% of the 82 agreements of the 250 something that the OECD has as its legal framework. It's the country that has joined more agreements than anybody who's a candidate. We're doing that. We'll continue to do that, and we think that there is a tremendous positive play that can come from OECD. What we do with Europeans and what we are doing with the United States and what we are doing to do domestically. So one complements the other. If I can mention one thing, just to complement, if I have time for that very briefly, I'd just like to mention a couple of sectors where we also want to deepen our relationship with the United States, which we didn't mention, like space cooperation. It's not only the satellite launching from the Alcântara base. We had the technological safeguards agreement signed last year. It's in full force in Brazil. Brazilian Congress did a tremendous job, both the Chamber and the Senate, approving that at record speed. And the Brazilian Space Agency is working very closely with American companies to try to put that to good use very soon. We're also working with NASA within the Artemis project. We also have a tremendous cooperation in the defense and military industries and so on. Just to highlight those other areas which, I didn't mention before, to see how broad this cooperation is and how broad this agenda is. And of course, getting into the OECD is paramount into that effort.
Thank you, sir. I do believe we have Ambassador Chapman back on. He'll be audio only. Ambassador Chapman, can you hear us? We'll give him a few minutes. Ambassador Chapman, can you hear me? Well, I'll give him a minute. Ambassador Forster, I also wanted to ask you about the World Trade Organization, because Brazil's been formally showing interest in joining the WTO's government procurement pact. What does this mean for Brazil going forward?
It means a lot. It's another very important signal in the same direction of economic reform for Brazil. Brazil's going to be has been the first Latin American country to formally announce its bid to join the pact. It will open for Brazil the government procurement markets of 34 other countries. That's a market estimating $1.7 trillion every year. Brazil has the 6th largest market in the world for government procurement, so there are many opportunities in Brazil, with all the needs we have in infrastructure and so on. What will it bring? It will bring transparency. It will help us, curb corruption, strengthen our ability of governance in that area, which is, again, a vital area for economic reform. So it's part of the broader effort, and it's a great one, I think.
Thank you, sir. I did want to, I know we are maybe 13 minutes out, and we have AmCham CEO Deborah Vietas will join us in a little bit to close the event. But Ambassador Forster, I wanted to ask you 2 kind of concluding questions. One is, the long-term goal here is the conclusion of, in addition to a free trade agreement, a double taxation agreement, a bilateral investments agreement. So in what ways could these 3 agreements open doors for your economy? And lastly, my last question to you would be, if you could leave us with a sense of what your vision for the bilateral relationship is, both yet this year and beyond into 2021.
Excellent. Look, we've been trying to do a double taxation agreement for a long time. It's a shame we haven't been able to conclude it. I think we are very close now in terms of, the willingness to do it. Of course, it would be wise to see the final form that tax reform takes in the Brazilian Congress. Let's see that bill gets approved, hopefully by the end of this year. And then we'll be in a tremendous position to, sit down with our American friends at Treasury and other agencies and have this done. The same goes for the investment agreement. We have come much closer in recent years. We had basic differences in dispute settlement, etc. We are past that now, which I think will open the door for us to have some sort of investment agreement. Which again, it's something that the private sector wants. The CEO Forum has been recommending, the think tanks and so on. And it's something that we see is very much in our interest in trying to attract investment. Looking forward, there's one thing that Brazil is poised, I think, to bring together several factors which I already mentioned here: domestic economic reform, the agreement, the free trade agreement with the European Union, which will come into force in 1 or 2 years. Our ongoing talks with the United States for a closer economic and trade relationship, our accession to the OECD. All those point in the same direction of a more open Brazil, a Brazil where you can do business at a lower cost with more incentives and more efficiency. We hope that might position Brazil to benefit from some of the rerouting in chains of supply, chains of value that might be redirection closer to the United States or closer to our hemisphere. Brazil will be ready to take those investments and make the best, thinking about of course bringing economic opportunity for all Brazilians. Just one concluding thing. So I see that Ambassador Chapman is back. We can leave some hard questions for him. Just want to mention one thing. Looking forward, we have a big milestone coming up for Brazilians. In 2022, we'll celebrate the 200th anniversary of our independence. And I think we should mark that with symbolic things. One of the things that we've been thinking about is doing a joint scientific experiment on board of the Artemis project. So Brazil and US cooperate in science, in some sort of lunar experiment. That's one thing that's, very symbolic, kind of visionary. But of course, that comes with all this very large agenda. And I think we can, looking, let's say, into 2022, I would hope to get there with a stronger and deeper partnership between the 2 largest democracies in the Western Hemisphere, countries who share, so much history, principles, values, and who are, today coming so closer together in part to the proximity of our heads of state. That's, I would say, for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Forster. Welcome back, Ambassador Chapman. I know that we always run the risk of internet issues. It's no problem, and our audience is very used to it. And you came back at a perfect moment, I think, to sort of close out our session with priorities for the future. We took some questions from the audience, not only about the possibility of a free trade agreement and when we might expect that, which I'll pose to you that question as well. But then I did also want to pose to you 2 final questions. The first is, what do you think the two countries can be doing together in addition to what they're doing now? What other opportunities are there as we look to 2021? And the second question is the one that I just asked Ambassador Forster as well, is could you leave us with a sense of what your vision is for the bilateral relationship, both this year yet and into next year?
Yeah, thank you very much, Roberta. And I'm sorry that the internet here at the house went out and I was scrambling, but I'm back. And I'm sure that I agree with everything Ambassador Forster said in my absence, but I will go back and check the tape. You can be sure of that. You know, this is a relationship that is mature, that's got history, it's broad, it's deep, but it is still, in my view, one that can be so enhanced because our bilateral trade is $105 billion a year. And our bilateral trade with Mexico is over $600 billion a year. So it's why I have set for ourselves a very ambitious target of doubling our trade in 5 years. And at 15% growth a year, that's possible. How do you get there? You get there by improving the overall business climate here in Brazil to make it more attractive for investment, not less attractive. And you do it by reducing every kind of non-tariff trade barrier you can imagine. And the good thing that's happening right now is that's exactly what we're working on as a team. Our economic teams are meeting constantly to look at very specific issues, which was what I was talking about when I got cut off, is that the more specific the dialogue, you then know the more progress that you're going to be making. And that is the objective that's been set for us by our presidents, a very ambitious target to reach for commercial agreements that will advance this relationship. And that's what we're about. And that's what we're working on. You know, what can we do together? I think that one thing that you have to look at is as the world is reconsidering value chains and where we should have strategic production agreements with countries that share values, certainly Brazil is one of the places where United States private sector is going to be looking, because Brazil is an established industrial nation and it shares our values, and it's one that we want to get closer to. So this is a tremendous time for us to do the spade work necessary to allow that to happen towards the end of this year and the beginning of next year. And so I think that's a tremendous opportunity. What's the vision for this relationship? Our presidents have been very clear. They want to see this become a fundamentally strong alliance, a North-South American alliance here in the Western Hemisphere that really sets the course when it comes to shared values, when it talked about bringing together our production cycles and our investment flows going both ways. This is a relationship that is destined to grow. And our job as leaders of our embassies in each other's country is to facilitate those kinds of discussions. And the good news is that is happening. And so I'm very bullish on where we're going to be going with this relationship over the next 12 to 18 months.
Thank you so much, sir. I think that's the perfect place to leave our conversation for today. I do want to take the last 5 minutes to introduce Débora Vietas. She is the CEO of AmCham Brazil. AmCham Brazil's vice president is one of the co-authors of our report, and the Portuguese version of which we're launching today. Débora, I want to pass the floor on to you for your perspectives also from the commercial side of things on the future of a multi-chapter trade agreement and its impacts, the potential of a free trade agreement, and really what opportunities are there for deepening U.S.-Brazil trade and FDI.
Thank you, Roberta. After such an inspired conversation between Ambassador Chapman and Forster, I would like to wrap up this relevant seminar with a message from the business sector. In line with what was said here, I believe we have a great opportunity before us to enhance the bilateral trade and investment ties between Brazil and the US. Our relationship has been underperforming for too long, and finally, we have the chance to aim for higher ground. In order to make the best out of this opportunity, it is crucial to strike the right balance between short and mid-term initiatives, or in other terms, between being pragmatic and having ambitious goals. By the way, just as suggested in the report released today by the Atlantic Council and Apex Brazil. In this sense, we should seize the momentum built in this past 18 months between the two governments to secure what we call the phase one of a bilateral trade agreement still in 2020, including commitments in the areas that were mentioned, such as trade facilitation, good regulatory practices, digital trade, anti-corruption as well. These disciplines would modernize the legal framework which regulates trade and investments between the two countries, as well as unlock economic benefits for both of our countries. They would also serve as an initial step toward concluding a more comprehensive agreement in the future. Also, in the near term, we understand that there are other relevant initiatives at hand, such as the full participation of Brazil in the global entry, the initiation of formal talks for a treaty to avoid double taxation, the adoption of e-documents in bilateral trade, and the implementation of the recommendations of the CEO Forum. These actions are feasible, although they demand political support and considerable hard work from both sides. And they are even more valuable in the current context when we are facing harsh social and economic consequences of this unprecedented pandemic, with brutal recession in global trade and investments. Beyond 2020, we should aim for concluding the double taxation agreement, as well as a comprehensive trade agreement, including issues such as tariffs, services, and public procurement. In this sense, having already achieved a phase one deal will be indeed of great help. And should the US government use the window they still have this year to consult with Congress and perhaps even notify its intent to negotiate a trade agreement with Brazil, that should be one step closer to our goal. Of course, considering the US elections in next November and the fact that there is no consensus for the negotiation of a more comprehensive trade agreement with Brazil, there is the issue of continuity. Leading a non-partisan organization such as AmCham Brazil, I felt it is important to say that regardless of the results of the elections, it is of utmost relevance to create the conditions for the continuity of these initiatives. And this includes, obviously, the improvement of Brazil's relations with the US Congress, which will be key to any future agreement. But I couldn't end without thanking the Atlantic Council and APEX for the long partnership with AmCham Brazil. My special thanks to Adrian Erst, Jason Marshall, Roberta Braga, and all other members of the Atlantic Council's team who worked for the success of this meeting today. My enthusiastic greetings as well to General Gerson Menandro and to Mr. Sergio Segovia, President of APEX. I also reiterate the great interest and the support of AmCham Brazil to this next level of development of the bilateral relations, and bid good luck to both our ambassadors in this mission.
Thank you so much, Deborah. I do want to reiterate, thank you to Apex Brazil for the ongoing partnership. Thank you to AmCham. We've been working conversations with you for so long, and it's really great to have you close today's event. Thank you, Ambassadors Forster and Chapman. We at the Atlantic Council look forward to continuing this work. And I do want to let everyone know that the next event of the series is confirmed for June 16th from 9 to 10 a.m. Eastern, and we will have representatives from the private sector sharing their perspectives in Portuguese, one of which will be Abrão Neto, one of the authors of the report and Executive Vice President of AmCham Brazil. So thank you again to everyone who joined today. Thank you to all of our speakers, and we look forward to continuing to engage with you. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Roberta. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Roberta.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, this is Jackson Styrman from the Atlantic Council. We are no longer streaming on our social media feeds, but we still have a number of participants left in the Zoom session. So we're going to end it here. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.